Good afternoon, everybody. This is Philippe Le Corre. I'm glad to be hosting this webinar. And I thank you to ESSEC Technical Services for helping me, especially Florent Philippe. The way it's going to work today, we're going to address China and Europe. It's a very wide angle, you might say. But we're going to talk, of course, in the context of COVID-19. But what I want to do today is to cover the stakes of the China-Europe relationship. When I say Europe, of course, I mean the EU, but I mean also the UK, which is about to leave the EU, but also countries at the periphery of Europe, for example, the West Balkans, Norway, or Switzerland. For the past 7 years, I've been researching China-Europe relations, and I've been writing on a few countries, including the UK, the Czech Republic, France, Greece, Portugal, Serbia. So I have a few case studies and I'm going to use those. Of course, Italy is an obvious one due to the current stage of the pandemic. And the way we're going to work, I'm going to speak for about 20-25 minutes and address the subject in 3 parts. Then afterwards, there'll be time for Q&A. Obviously, if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A function. But obviously, since I'm talking to you, and I won't be able to answer right away, but I'll try to take a break in the middle so that we can have an exchange, just like in a normal classroom. So the way I'm going to address the subject is the following. Part 1, I will look at the state of affairs between China and Europe today, and you know, I'm going to cover the relationship really over the past 45 years very quickly. It's going to be an overview. Secondly, I will look at what has changed with COVID-19 really. And both in terms of the Sino-European cooperation, as well as the Chinese public diplomacy, which has been very much in the news for the past couple of weeks. I'll also look at European public opinion perceptions, which I think is very important. And again, I think COVID-19 will remain as a sort of a game changer when it comes to relations between China and Europe. And of course, the third part will be, I will be looking at the policy consequences, the policy implications of all this. And I'll try to take a look at the long-term relations between China and Europe. So feel free to ask questions. I'll do my best to answer. It's going to be a conversation rather than a lecture. Obviously, we're using technical means, but it's a topical theme. You know, we've been hearing a lot about China. China is obviously a global player. The COVID-19 pandemic has a geopolitical dimension, and China is certainly at the center of it, I would say. So let me switch to the first part of my presentation, which is the China-Europe state of affairs. And first, let me just remind you that a number of large countries in Europe have had close relations with China for a very long time. For example, France was the first country to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1964, sending an ambassador. Germany, of course, came later, but had you know, an embassy in 1972, then eventually merged its embassy in 1990 with the East German embassy. And of course, Germany is now a very strong partner of China, at least economic partner. And the UK, you know, has had never really closed its embassy in China, even though it didn't have an ambassador for some time. So these 3 countries, of course, are strong partners of China. have had, long-term relations. And that matters a lot because some other countries in Europe do not have this sort of long-standing relations. Although some countries of the sort of Eastern European bloc maybe are in a different position, which I will also address. So now coming to the EU itself, because obviously this is, you may not know it, but it's the 45th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between China and the EU. And, it's obviously a close cooperation, mainly economic and trade relationship. The daily trade between the EU and China is no less than 1 billion euro a day. And there are many, many exchanges. In fact, up to 60 dialogues a year between China and the People's Republic of China. I'm not talking here about Taiwan, although Taiwan has also been in the news due to the pandemic. As you know, Taiwan is not a member of the WHO and is only recognized by a handful of nations. And it's been part of the controversy really around the way China and other countries have handled the situation. 2019 was a pivotal year for China-Europe relations, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But 2020 promises to be an even more critical year for reasons that hopefully will appear obvious in the next few minutes. The economic relations, obviously, are a key element of the Sino-European dialogue, and not just because of the trade relationship, but generally because in the 1990s, the Chinese government launched a policy called 走出去, which means going out, which means reaching out to the rest of the world, and that included acquiring brands and technology. And of course, Europe was a prime target for this. And it started looking abroad for natural resources first, but that was mainly in Africa, in Australia, and different parts of the world. But then Europe became interesting as a market and as a source of technology, particularly. As I said, the EU is China's top trade partner, so it's a very important destination for Chinese investments. And then, the investments, as you can see on the screen, have been, going across the board across countries, across sectors, and they've reached a peak in 2016, very interestingly, with a lot of opportunities that came around during the previous economic crisis, which was, as you may recall, 2008, 2010, when a number of countries, particularly in Southern Europe, reached very dear economic conditions, and were asked by at the time the Troika, the European Union, the European Commission, and the IMF, and the European Central Bank to privatize some of the state assets in order to pay their debts. Mainly, it was a debt crisis. Not only a debt crisis, there were of course social consequences and economic consequences. And obviously, China was slightly opportunistic about it and offered to take over some of these assets through M&A and through acquisitions, and most of it came in the form of sovereign funds or equity and M&A and things like that. But there were, of course, a number of state-owned enterprises that participated in this move, and that, of course, led to a number of questioning in Europe, I would say in the West in general, for what China was looking for and what consequences it might lead to. In 2019, today, the the level of investment has dropped. We are back to 2014 levels, interestingly. And that's mainly due to the restrictions imposed by the Beijing government, the administrative restrictions due to a number of, what they call irrational capital outflows. And of course, there's also it's not just being on the China side. There's been a policy launched on the European side to somewhat screen foreign investments in Europe. And that includes, of course, Chinese investments. It's also switched back to more perhaps private investments, and a lot of investments through foundations and banks and private entities, a little bit less so through state-owned enterprises. Let me just say a few words also about China's Europe strategy. It's not just about investments, it's not just about trade, it's also about raising the flag, really, and expanding China's role in the world. China has clear ambitions to be a big power, if not a superpower, and it's had a fairly pro-EU policy over the past 30 years. It's in favor of the single market, but it's also used, some sort of divide and conquer ways, including setting up something called the 16+1 mechanism, which is basically 16 countries plus China, mainly from the Baltic states, from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. It's added Greece last year. And the other thing it did, it started investing a lot in the West Balkans, and mainly in countries that are not part of the European Union. And it also launched, of course, in 2013, something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major geopolitical initiative from President Xi Jinping. Now you see on this map the BRI. It's a global infrastructure network. It goes, in different directions, and in many ways, although now, of course, it's not just in between China and Europe, but China certainly, the European destination is a critical one, and you can see that either on land or over the Indian Ocean all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Europe is a key destination, mainly because it's a key market, and China has ambitions, for example, in Africa, in Southern Europe. It has a maritime strategy, which is why it's invested in so many ports. The most famous case being, of course, the Piraeus harbor in Athens, in Greece. It's taken over 67% of the Piraeus harbor in 2016, and it's using it mainly to export more via Greece. Now we'll see what happens, of course, now with the COVID crisis, and it's certainly not going to be an easy economic situation for the next few years. I'll just add that generally the diplomatic offensive of China has somewhat backfired maybe over the past few years, as there've been attempts to engage with the EU on one side, but also with through the 16+1 mechanism. And there's an impression of China wanted to use its own ways to communicate with individual countries. You could call that divide and conquer. Certainly there are special friendships with countries like Hungary, Greece, Portugal, the West Balkans, as I mentioned, and Italy. Italy is the first country which has signed the Belt and Road Initiative Memorandum of Understanding last year. Not much has happened since, but that was, Italy being a G7 country, that was considered a very important element. Now, just let's look now at the perception of this drive, of this European drive by China. And as you can see, this policy and these charts you're going to see now, of course, were conducted last year by the Pew Research Center in Washington. Some of them from 2018 as well. It's a mix of 2018, 2019, and it's a mixed picture really. And people see China as a more ambitious, of course, power. The values that it brings are somewhat different from the Western values. And certainly you can see, if we can go a couple of slides further, you can see that China's increasing global roles does not translate into support for Chinese leadership. That's the most important message, perhaps, conveyed by these pools. It hasn't been a very successful, I mean, in terms of China promoting its political model, I don't think, people in the West have been convinced. And that brings me to my part two, which is, what really has changed with COVID-19? And although, geopolitics seems to be to come second next to the sort of sanitary situation, it's fair to say that China has increased its political footing in Europe through public diplomacy, through health issues, and also the fact that the COVID-19, the coronavirus, originated in China, and people know that. I mean, China has been, of course, sort of countering this narrative and trying to project another image of as a sort of global country, and we should all work together against the pandemic. At the same time, we all know that the first cases emerged in China, and the rest of the world is obviously struggling as well, and China is struggling too economically. No need to stress, how difficult it's going to be for the Chinese economy to recover, considering not just the domestic economy is facing difficulties, but also in terms of exports. China is an export-driven economy, and very little business going on at the moment, although it's picking up. One aspect I want to underline is what people have called the mask diplomacy. And China obviously has launched, you could say, a coordinated public policy approach in March 2020 by reaching out to countries that, and particularly countries, part of the Chinese sphere of influence, which were in need for masks, for ventilators, for test kits, and things like that were sort of badly missing in many of these countries. And it's also created social media accounts. Chinese embassies particularly started communicating through Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. And it's kind of new, I mean, many of these accounts were set up in a matter of months, with obviously a willingness to bring forward the Chinese message to the West. It hasn't really worked that well, because although in some cases politicians have reacted very enthusiastically, in Hungary, in Serbia, and the Italian foreign minister also said that China's help was very very much welcome. Now, obviously, you don't turn away masks. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. But it was accompanied by a sort of a rewriting of the narrative, which was not that much liked. Particularly, China sort of rejected the idea that that COVID-19 was a Chinese virus, as you know, in the United States. That's what the Trump administration has been trying to promote as a message. So in Italy, for example, the public opinion is very mixed about this, has mixed feelings. There's been also the talks about a health Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is another word for the new Silk Road, and there was a health element that suddenly came back. And of course, China has been trying to promote it. At the same time, it's fair to say that the current crisis will be a game changer in many issues. For example, supply chains to ideological competition. European governments will probably rebalance their view towards China in many ways. And that's really a lot to do with the way Beijing handled the pandemic. And you had also reactions from the European Commission. And that's been also quite controversial, because the European External Action Service had to somewhat amend one of its reports that was about the narratives and the propaganda aspects of the narratives behind the pandemic. And that was, kind of noticed that China put pressure because it didn't want to be associated with the start of the pandemic. And there was also recently an affair regarding an op-ed, an opinion piece in the China Daily, one of China's English language newspapers, where there was a paragraph concerning the same subject that was asked to, the ambassadors the European ambassadors to China were asked to modify the op-ed, and so there was some kind of censorship that wasn't really much appreciated. Let me sort of wrap up this part with the policy consequences, and I've already alluded to this. The COVID-19 crisis has hit at a time when debates over the role of China were sort of picking up in Europe, perhaps becoming a more coherent. And in fact, if we can switch to the European Union, the 10 points strategy that was yes, the 10 actionable steps for the EU. So what happened last year in April? The EU came up with a new definition of the relationship with China and called China, among other things, a systemic rival, and called for the relationship to be more balanced with reciprocity, and ask for these 10 actionable steps to be taken. Now, I have to say, if you look at the list, very few of them have been actually met by either side, and mainly on the Chinese side, there are talks at the moment over a bilateral investment treaty, and it's very, very slow. Obviously, there was a meeting supposed to take place between the leadership of the EU in March in Beijing that was postponed. And now we're looking at the next step, which will be the Leipzig leaders meeting in Germany between President Xi Jinping and the European heads of states and heads of government. Now, we're not even sure whether this will take place. Obviously, the agenda is very shaky at the moment. China itself will host the National People's Congress, its annual parliamentary session next week, in fact, at the end of next week. And obviously, it's a very important political moment. My impression is that it's going to be asserting itself even more, and the domestic narrative, the domestic matters will come first. And whenever a Chinese ambassador in Europe criticize the way Europeans have been handling the pandemic, we've seen a lot of that, and it's been quite shocking, really, in some cases. It's aimed, of course, at the sort of the party membership in China and the general public in China. The problem is, the backlash in Europe has been quite strong. People could see that the Chinese government tried to reach out primarily to its community of friends through political donations. It's also been donating to members of the Chinese diaspora. And the way China has been handling this as a sort of authoritarian state has not been well perceived by Europeans. So the crisis is somewhat intensifying demands for Europe to put its China policy on a more sort of balanced footing. And I think, you know, it's a good opportunity really to rediscuss. And I think, you know, we've heard a lot about the Europeans being divided on their China policy. In a way, it's a game changer again. And I think even in Eastern Europe, people are starting to wonder about the Belt and Road Initiative, about the 16+1, now 17+1. And then, you know, I mentioned the economic side and the supply chains, which will be a big issue, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry. Some companies will obviously switch some of their production facilities from China to other parts of the world. At the same time, it's not going to be easy, and it may not be as large scale as people expected. But China really did not really, I think, anticipate the reaction that is now taking place, even though, of course, it is still a divided European Union, but at least you now have in place a screening mechanism for foreign investments, and so on strategic issues, technology and strategic issues. 5G obviously is a big topic coming up, and we have Chinese companies competing for a big share of that market. But also connectivity is a big issue that Europe has been investing a lot on. So if we can move to the last slide, I'll perhaps present my takeaway from this. The EU remains divided, but hardening is noticeable, and particularly the countries I've mentioned here. Germany, as the sort of top economic player in Europe, remains prudent, and that's mainly due to the special relationship that's been taking place over the past 30 years between the German industries and China. The car industry particularly is very much dependent on the Chinese market. 5G again, you know, major topic of the year. Will it be delayed? Will there be more restrictions? Will there be more debate about allowing Huawei in particular to be a bidder for 5G technology? And then, of course, the EU-China summit, you know, and how to handle China in general as a global player, as a country very ambitious, which wants to set the agenda, especially when it comes to its own role in the world, which I think is something that we should always underline. So I'll stop here, and I'll take your questions. Obviously, I didn't mention the US elections that are coming up, but US-China frictions, of course, have been a very sort of permanent component of geopolitics over the past 3 years under the Trump administration. There was a trade deal signed at the beginning of the year that didn't really lead to any concrete results. And now, of course, the rhetoric that Trump is using vis-a-vis China has been is harder and harder, and Mike Pompeo as well, the Secretary of State. It's very difficult to have a dialogue when you use such tough language. And of course, China has reciprocated by alluding to all kinds of things. Some of them, you know, fake news, really, including the fact, you know, the US military would have brought the coronavirus into China back in November last year. This has not helped, really, in the world of fake news. And one of my colleagues gave a very good presentation on this subject a couple of weeks ago. You know, China would actually help itself by, you know, presenting, you know, its government as a very reliable, a safe pair of hands, a member of the UN Security Council, as opposed to encouraging what you call the wolf diplomacy. Anyway, so let's go with a an initial question. You can follow me on Twitter, by the way, or on LinkedIn. You'll find all my publications. But I will take a first question here. The fact that China does not want to impose its way of life or culture on the world, is this a strong point? Well, it doesn't want to impose its way of life, but if you could argue that many of the regimes, I would say the less democratic regimes in places from Africa to the Middle East or Asia, and Southeast Asia in particular, I'm thinking of Cambodia, Laos, especially. These governments have actually been welcoming the way the Chinese Communist Party is handling politics and economics, and not that they can necessarily emulate that system, because the Chinese system is unique. The Communist Party of China is unique. It's one of the very few ruling communist parties today, and it doesn't hide itself that the fact it's communist, and it's heading towards the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party very soon. In Europe, of course, it's more complicated. I don't believe the Europeans are prepared for joining a sort of China-led world. But you have a number of people, and some of them being proxies for the Chinese government, advocating for a Europe-China close partnership, carrying away the Europeans away from the transatlantic alliance and getting closer to China. Now, obviously, for Europe, which is like in the middle, obviously with NATO, with a strong American presence, a strong American partnership for all these years, and so many common values between Americans and Europeans. It's a long way to go, and I don't believe China is really helping itself through its propaganda and mass diplomacy, as you call it, over the past couple of months. So it hasn't been really successful. But again, the main purpose for these actions are bringing back good messages to the Chinese general public, and showing that a lot of people care about what China is doing, and trying to help basically the Chinese government to win the war against the virus. Second question. There's been little progress on the 10 actionable steps for the EU. This looks similar to the South China Sea Code of Conduct that was never concluded. What's your opinion? Well, South China Sea is a completely different story. China doesn't recognize the International Arbitration Court that in 2016, made a judgment saying that China has broken some rules in the South China Sea, and therefore gave helped basically the case for the Philippines and the countries that were actually wanted to divide things better, if you want. And when it comes to the EU, it's a different situation, because China really needs the European economy, the European markets. China, as I said, is an export-driven economy. It needs to interact with large markets, and the EU is the top trading entity in the world, even bigger than the US. The US-China relationship is as bad as it gets now. Therefore, Europe is too important for China. And for China not complying with some of these proposals, especially the role of the Chinese state, the fact, the Chinese market has not been open enough to foreign companies, including European ones. And the fact there have been unfair subsidies to Chinese companies in Europe. All these things, could be settled through a sort of bilateral agreements on investments. But that hasn't been, there hasn't been much progress really for the past few months. Now, obviously, we know one of the reasons, but but before this whole thing started, on the EU side, people were complaining about the slow progress. There's a question on to what extent China is okay with Russia line of action towards EU. So, I mean, now, you know, in some cases, China is emulating the Russian sort of political war that is taking place in Europe and or in America, and that's what you've seen in some of these Twitter accounts I was referring to earlier, and websites of embassies, for example, the Chinese embassy to France, but also the Chinese embassy to Italy, or the Chinese ambassador to the UK. Some of these diplomats have been sort of very aggressive and critical of the European ways of not just handling the pandemic, the epidemic, but also, you know, for example, when the name of Taiwan is mentioned, when people, you know, criticize Chinese actions, this is considered as forbidden territory for foreign countries to address. But, you know, the way the media functions, think tanks, NGOs, private citizens in the West is quite different from China. And in China these days, you know, NGOs are heavily restricted. There is no freedom of the press, and it's a completely different system. Do you think the EU and the USA, even Russia, will take closer common actions regarding China after COVID-19? So it's hard to read the Russian policy. You know, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are very close allies, you could say, for obvious reasons. But at the same time, the borders, the Russian borders were closed. Have been closed for some time since the start of the epidemic. Therefore, I think in Russia we don't know the state of the pandemic, but it's been very serious. I mean, the Russian population has been hit very badly. Now, for Russia to agree with the West on dealing with China, I think there's a long way to go before that. What is your insight on the growing influence of China in the Western Balkans, especially in Serbia, regarding their security cooperation? And how do you think the EU should behave in that regards? So Serbia, the rest of the West Balkans, with the exception of Croatia, which is an EU member, these 5 or 6 countries, I say 6 because Kosovo, of course, is not considered a country by China. It's considered a country by most European nations, including the EU. But you know, Kosovo, of course, is by Chinese standards or Serbian standards a province of Serbia, and therefore China, of course, which doesn't want anybody to talk about Taiwan as a country, which is a de facto country, in fact, wants to protect Serbia's rights to sort of supervise Kosovo, so to speak. So there is a very close relationship between China and Serbia, no doubt about this. There are strong investments. Chinese citizens do not need visas to go to Serbia. There are major investments in Chinese investments in Serbia, in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, and even in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, the security elements, of course, is complicated because a couple of these countries are NATO members, but not Serbia. And Serbia, of course, has had a difficult time since the civil war of the 1990s. It's a candidate country to the EU, and as are all the others. But obviously, the EU is not in great shape and is not really prepared to welcome more member states for the time being. There is actually a security element of this cooperation, including having Chinese police in the streets of Belgrade, which is somewhat puzzling, really, for a European country. But at the same time, the Serbian authorities and President Vučić have been saying, look, the EU doesn't want us, so why shouldn't we be talking to China? Since we have a long-term relationship. China speaks of Serbia as a sort of a friendly, a brother country, if you want, back from the sort of socialist times when Serbia was led by Tito, and Tito was at some point friendly with China, not always, but that brings sort of the two countries together, and that's actually a big question for the EU, whether Brussels wants to embrace the West Balkans so that it doesn't fall into the hands of Russia or China, or whether it's too busy with itself, dealing with the economic crisis that's coming out of the pandemic, or dealing with issues that are already taking place. And as I said, this is a 2008 moment. 12 years ago, we had a serious debt crisis, and then a number of countries were sort of desperate, felt very unhappy with Northern Europe, with Brussels, with the European institutions, with the IMF. The question is whether this time is going to be different or not, and where China, Russia, other players will stand. In my case, I'm mostly interested in China, and I think we haven't got the answer yet. But the way Beijing has been handling this situation since March is not really calling for a close cooperation, at least not from at the EU level. Do you think the West is seeing COVID-19 pandemics as a chance to go back to Africa, and how? Well, unfortunately, when you look at the lack of investment, particularly from the US in Africa, and I wouldn't think too much of the Americans there. When it comes to Europe, I think many people are concerned with Africa, and the COVID-19 will be another catastrophe, maybe in that part of the world. And as neighbors, as close neighbors, Europeans should obviously take action, whether they can afford it, whether it's the right moment. But I was talking to you earlier about the backlash that the Chinese propaganda campaign has led to in Europe. There's been such thing in Africa as well. There've been the government of Kenya, for example, was very unhappy with the way Kenyan students were treated in China. At the heart of the lockouts in China, and they were not allowed to travel, and they were not offered to stay, and it was a difficult time. I'll take maybe your last question, if you don't mind, and it's about the Belt and Road Initiative. As China announced the massive new infrastructure investment as reaction to the COVID-19 impact, do you think the BRI investment will slow down and go to a smaller scale? Well, to be honest, I think it's been slowing down anyway. It's still a sort of a policy message that China is trying to broadcast to the world. Now, obviously, it's Xi Jinping's signature plan. So Xi Jinping is in power for quite some time. No doubt about that. He's not going to leave power anytime soon. So the BRI will still be used as a tool, as a sort of a public policy tool, as a geopolitical tool. But it hasn't really got much takers in Europe, especially. There's very few BRI investments in Europe. It's mainly in the developing world. I mean, for even Piraeus in Greece, it's now considered as a Belt and Road project, but it was not at the beginning. So it became sort of Belt and Road because it suits the narrative. So I think I think China is a bit concerned with the Chinese public, the way the Chinese public has been reacting to the Belt and Road. And since the Chinese economy is not doing that well at the moment, investing abroad too much will not be well perceived domestically. Therefore, I think it's going to be scaled down for a while. It may come back, but you have to keep in mind that in Europe, for example, there's also a new connectivity strategy that is supposed to, offer an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, and that Europeans and Americans also have been talking to each other, and Japanese and Indians and others, in order to sort of offer new ways to connect, and not necessarily the Chinese way. So I think we'll leave it here, if you don't mind. I hope I've answered most of your questions, but you can reach out to me, through various means, and I'm glad to have had this chance to exchange. And I hope you'll stay in touch with the ESSEC webinars series. And that's all for me today.